A gigantic dragon is cool. What? Let's see how to slice it. Alright guys, we are at the process slicer with the files on the build plate, and if you want to check this model, the link is on the description to the STLFlix platform. Okay guys, we have two main subjects to talk about in here. First, the layer height, alright? We have small parts of this model, which we are going to use smaller layer heights because we need more details, and also small pieces. And we have bigger objects that we are going to use bigger layer heights. This is the first subject. And also we need to talk about supports. We have three types of objects in here: objects that don't need supports at all, objects that may need supports but not mandatorily, and we have objects that definitely need supports. Okay, so let's start with the teeth. Then we are going to see some tips about first layer as well. So let me erase all those gigantic parts in here, and let's arrange our build plate. We don't need you for now. Okay, now it's all organized. I'm going to use my standard profile with 0.16 millimeters. I'm not going to put 0.12, which is the highest resolution that we could do, or 0.08, which would be even crazier. We are going to use 0.16 because it's a huge object. Everyone's going to see by far like this, like you are seeing in this video. So it's not so important. We are going to use just in here to be safer and to in a matter to look nicer. Okay, my biggest concern in here is the attachment to the build plate in first place. So let me give you some tips about the bring option. We are going to use 5 millimeters and also a separation gap to be easier to remove. All right, so let's slice it and see how it looks. If you don't like the bring, which is my case, I don't appreciate it because it's hard to remove sometimes, you can disable this option only in the objects that we don't need. For example, those pins in here. In the teeth, I recommend you, okay? But in the pins, we may use or may not. You can use the same option for the whole build plate, but if you want to change just in this part in here, you can right click it, add settings, and then skirt and bring. You can put bring separation and width, and we are going to put 0 in here, and then reslice it. And now we only have bring on the teeth. And now just a few tips about first layer configuration, because I don't recommend you guys to change your first layer height from 0.2, for example, because if you set your Z offset, the distance between the nozzle and the build plate, you are going to configure it for 0.2, so don't change it, okay? The same works for the extrusion width in the first layer, all right? I don't change these values because once worked, I keep the same value for every print. So if I change the layer height, will be changed only in the other layer heights, in the following layers of the print, but not in the first. And now talking about build plates with multiple objects, let's take a look at a Lift Z option, which I think it's a good option to use in here, okay? So at Filament Settings tab, we are going to click in Filament Overrides and then use Hamping Lift. We are going to enable this, and then we are going to set the maximum height of this lift, okay, which will be something like 0.2 or 0.24, okay? This is a average that I recommend you. I will use in this case 0.2, and guys, don't forget to use the Hamp Slope Angle. I almost forgot. We are going to use in here 20 degrees, okay, as an inclination for the movement of the nozzle. Now I'm going to show you. Let's enable the travel movement, and I will find one point as an example. All right, we have an example in here. We are going to print every single part of those teeth, and then we are going to see the movement right here. We are finishing this part of the layer, and then when it's over, the nozzle is going to move to the other tooth. and then this movement is going to put the nozzle a little bit higher than the pieces, all right? So this movement is going to avoid the nozzle hitting some of those pieces. All right, guys, I think this is enough for those small pieces, and now we are going to look the bigger ones. First, we are going to take a look at the parts that don't need supports at all. We are going to change in here my standard profile for the 0.32 millimeters as layer height, because we don't need to be so careful about resolution in here, because it's a huge print. Again, it's a big print. We are going to see this as a helmet, so you don't need to waste a lot of time printing this, all right? So let's use 0.32 as a standard value for your first layer now on. So I just changed my layer height, and I'm going to show you my default value for the extrusion width, all right? So 0.48, that's what I'm going to use in here, because we increased the distance between the layers. The layer height is 0.32, which is bigger than 0.2, for example. So we are increasing the width. So we are going to fill this gap between every layer, okay? So let's keep this as a standard. I recommend you to do the same. And now let's just slice it. Okay, pretty simple, right? So now let's take a look at some parts that I think we may use supports, but it's not so necessarily. I will explain you why. So in order to understand why this part would need or don't need supports, we may take a look at the painting supports tool, and then we're going to highlight the overhang regions, all right? So we have some small regions of this part requiring supports, okay? We may don't need it, but we have a small region in contact to the build plate. So this is risky. This is something that I usually don't like. We are going to use the support in here as an extructor just to hold the print, all right? So let's first print these regions that we are seeing that needed, okay? And then I will explain you some points that you need to take, that you need to pay attention when you're using support in this way, okay? In here, we actually need supports in those small parts, like in here, in here. I will not put in here because I'm going to explain you something else, which will be useful in the next model. If you want to erase some painting, you can tap Shift on your keyboard, and then you can just erase some painting. And now, let's configure our support settings. In here, in the support material, we are going to enable the generate support material. It's already enabled. And we are going to choose the organic style, all right? And remember, something that I recommend you, if you are using a layer height bigger than 0.2, keep this value in your top contact Z distance, okay? When you are going to use smaller layer heights, I recommend you to keep one layer as this gap, for example, 0.2. But in this case, I will keep 0.2 as a limit, because if you use a distance as 0.32, this support, it's too far from the print and it's not going to work as we want, okay? So let's keep 0.2 in here. I'm not going to use a shelf around it. And we are going to use 4 interface layers in here. I want to be safe in this print. The interface pattern is spacing. I always recommend you to use 0. And let's take a look how is it going to go. So now, look, we have these supports holding the overhang regions, which is the main application for the supports. But in this case, I want something to hold this print in the build plate. And for this, the support is doing nothing for us, because look, in this part of the print, we have no contact between those two guys in here. So we are going to paint supports even where doesn't need it, okay? So look at the paint tool, we are going to increase this, which is the brush size, and we are going to paint like this. For example, this one, and then in here. We are going to do the same for this one until here. And don't worry, will be not so difficult to remove this because we already set good settings for the support, because this region is not an inclined part of the print, okay? So the support is just holding during the process and then will be easy to remove. Let's slice it. Now, look at this. When we are starting the print, the supports, it's really close to the model and we have something holding this part. And when it starts to increase, like in here, we have the real content. So this is going to enforce the print during the process, okay? So I recommend you to use this in this kind of situations. When you identify that you have a big object, but with a small content to the build plate, all right? And also, talking about regions that may need or may not need supports, look at this. Every time that you look at your model and you are seeing the internal perimeter outside of the model, in this case, we may need supports. But when these parts are small, we may print without supports. The cooling is going to work in here and we are fine, okay? So you have to look if this part is, if you have a long perimeter showing the internal part, or if it's just a small part in the model. In some cases, when we are print bust, for example, the nose presents these phenomena, but it's just a nose. It's really, really small, so we can go without supports. It's just an example. In this case, we don't need supports in here, but we are using just in those regions in order to hold this print, okay? And now let's take a look at a situation that it's mandatory to use supports. All right, now we have a huge part in here. I will slice it and show you before without supports. And now look in here, we have a lot of internal perimeters showing in the outside of the model. If you are having trouble identifying this, you can look at the legend. We have external perimeters in orange and perimeters in yellow. The yellow part is showing up in the outside of the model and we don't want this. But in some cases, in some prints, we have overhangs, which is this case. So to improve the finishing in this part, we are going to use support. So in here, supports, it's not just for holding the print, it's also to improve the finishing on these inclined areas, okay? So we are going to use the paint support tool. We are going to highlight the overhang regions, like 30. I'm going to be safer in here, okay? So let's use 35 degrees in this one, and then we can enforce it. And we are going to use supports in all blue parts. So remember, in the small parts, we don't need to use supports if we don't want them, okay? So in here, I'm going to tap Shift and then erase this. For this one, it's the same phenomenon. It's too small for we having trouble. The cooling is going to work in here. So let your printer cool down this without supports. We don't need in here. Okay, this is going to work, especially if you have a fancy printer, as a Bamboo, a K1, for example. We have a huge killer, so let's use, oh, sorry. And in this one, which is a bigger part, I will keep. For those in here, I think we don't need it. Let's increase the brush size, and now we are not going to use. And for these ones, I will keep. In here, I don't want. Not even here. And I think we are ready to go. Let's slice it. That is just something that I want to show you if you don't know yet. If you think in this case, I am not so sure if we are going to use this diameter. You can change the angle in here. I'm going to put 8 degrees just for testing. I am definitely more confident with this setting, okay? Because we have more contact in the build plate, and I was afraid of this support detached from the build plate, so you're going to use like this. Let me see. I would take those off, so let's tape shift and then erase it, always small region in here. Let's slice it. Okay, I think this is how we are going to go. Okay, supports where it's needed. This print has a huge attachment to the build plate, so we are fine. We just are going to use supports where we actually need it. But in this region, mainly in here, it's definitely mandatory. Okay, so use supports in this one. Check our settings, okay, in here, and I think you are going to be fine. I hope you learned something from this video, and I see you in the next one. I hope you guys enjoy it. Those slicing videos are an initiative from STL Academy, which is the educational project from STLFlix. So if you guys want to learn more about 3D printing, you could check our description and look at STL Academy courses. And don't forget, see you guys at the next slicing.